India and China, despite being two large countries, they have never gone to war till it happened in 1962. And what happened in 1962 is a big story, and I don't want to go into it, but I certainly think this is something that we could have avoided. There's also another interesting aspect in our relationship. Till the communists came to power, it was widely believed that India influenced China culturally. And in 1936, when Harvard celebrated its 300th anniversary, they invited scholars from all over the world to Harvard University. Harvard was founded in 1636, so 1936 they celebrated the tricentennial. And at that time, the scholars from all over the world. They called the president of Beijing University. His name was Dr. Hu Shi, one of the most famous poets of China. And he came, and his lecture, which Harvard published in the combined volumes of the tricentennial year, is titled Indianization of China, a case of peaceful cultural borrowing. Now, we have ourselves forgotten that history, but the Chinese remember, and Dr. Hu Shi is not very complimentary about Indianization of China. He thinks that all this negativism and pessimism in China he's talking about the 1936 period, was due to the fact that we Chinese absorbed everything from India through Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism that went to China is different from the Buddhism that went to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was the pure form of Buddhism, which was called Hinayana Buddhism, whereas what went to China was called Mahayana Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism is practically the same as Hinduism. And therefore, the concepts of karma and reincarnation, all these have been absorbed into the Chinese psyche. And when you travel as extensively in China as I have, I can tell you it's remarkable to see that families, the Moors, the evocatives, everything is so similar as to us. It's very easy to get used to China in no time, in peacetime. So in this background, I would say that we need now to evolve a policy. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of comparison of the two economies, let me say we need to evolve a policy which doesn't sacrifice our national interests, but it certainly preserves our ancient relationships. We must be have good relations with China without sacrificing our national interests. We need not be fooled into thinking they are our brothers, because even brothers can quarrel. In fact, quarrel between brothers tend to be more bitter than quarrel between friends. And Jawaharlal Nehru's great mistake was to assume that just because he said Hindi chini bye bye, that literally it's going to be Hindi chini bye bye. There are interests of the two countries which diverge, and either we should try to converge them, or we should prepare to meet the consequences of that divergence. Now, in view of this background, the fast growth, the question before us is: should we build on the positive factors that exist between two relationships, and emerge as global collaborators? Or do we learn from the past negative developments and prepare to compete with China? That is, competing with China literally means confronting with China. Now, which should we do? This is the question. If the two of us collaborate, we become very powerful. And that happened in Copenhagen recently in the environment conference. The two of us combined and the whole world just collapsed before us. And they agreed with the consensus draft that India and China together had prepared. But that is an optimistic scenario, that we collaborate with them. But if we compete with them, then of course it's going to be a confrontational situation, and whether we are ready for it. If we have no choice, of course we should be ready for it. Let me first just begin by a little history, by periodization of our relationship. The first period, which can be considered kind of homogeneous period, is 1870 to 1950. This is the period when India was ruled by Britain and China was not ruled by any foreigner, but it was besieged by 5-6 foreign countries which sought one concession after another concession from China. This is the period of the great decline of the two countries. And this decline took place very systematically, and it went over this entire period. And by 1950, both countries had become very poor. Then the period 1950 to 1978. This period is the period when both of us foolishly adopted the Soviet plan, the Soviet economic model, the Soviet planning techniques. And both of us adopted it in different versions. China, much more pure Soviet model, and we not so pure because we had some kind of a private sector, but it was hand and foot bound, but still the private sector existed. We had a democracy which China didn't have. Now, our having democracy has some disadvantages because anybody can come and travel anywhere in India and write whatever he likes. Whereas in China, it's not so easy to travel anywhere you like and write whatever you like, even now. As a consequence, India always gets a bad image compared to China. And all that foreigners can write about is the beggars that you see when you land from an airport and move out in the city. But in China, you don't see the beggars because they are kept away. They are beggars, but they are kept away. You don't see them. And people go to Shanghai and they go to Dalian and Beijing and then come back and go into raptures about how China has become a modern city. Let me tell you that China's modernity itself is not Chinese. It is based on foreign direct investment. And that foreign direct investment came because China removed all clamps on building activity. Any foreigner could come, their land would be given without hassle, and they would build on it, and all that one had to do was give away 2 floors to the Chinese, and the remaining would be the foreigners building. And much of Shanghai, much of Beijing, much of Dalian, and all these places have been built by foreigners on money from abroad. India could have had this kind of modernity had we also allowed foreign direct investment in real estate. We do not, because we are all the time quarreling, shall we do it, not do it, we go on discussing and discussing. And this is what has delayed the modernization of Indian cities. And we are allowed for foreign direct investment, then of course there are pluses and minuses, but certainly you would have had people coming and going completely gaga about how modern India has certainly become. So there again, it is not a Chinese achievement. So having said that, let me say that the Soviet period also was a disaster because it was unsuited for both our countries. The model was based on the principle that all the investments will be plowed into the capital goods industry and the resources for it would be squeezed out of agriculture, and there will be no exports and there will be no imports. That was the general Soviet model. The Soviet model, by the way, finally failed everywhere in the world, starting with India and China, and in the end even the Soviet Union. I remember the